So the first thing I would say is, we talked about this resentment. And so it doesn't have to be in reading a journal.
Right.
It could simply be in the way the husband is showing up and the wife is thinking, you have just betrayed me and now you're telling me you resent me. That isn't a great combination.
Right.
And so I think part of it is recognizing that resentment is typically, in my opinion, a place where there is grief and there is anger. And what has happened is I didn't feel permission to express the grief and I didn't feel permission to express the anger. So those have gotten twisted together and they're coming out unclean.
Welcome to the Faithful and True podcast. I'm Randy Everett, the co-host of the podcast. We're here with Dr. Greg Miller, our host as usual. And as promised on our last podcast, we have convinced Rebecca Dekkers from our staff to stay on board and help us continue this very interesting conversation that we started on questions or subjects that the wives of the men that we counsel, if they had the opportunity, what questions would they ask their counselor or their group leader? And we got off to a good start last time.
Absolutely. So Rebecca had this idea of just checking in with people in her group to see if the women had any specific questions that they would want to be able to ask their husband's therapist or counselor or group leader.
And again, this next topic, there was a number of different iterations of it. And so I'll just summarize it a little bit.
Yeah, sure.
And so, one of the things that often we become aware of, and it makes a lot of sense, and I think that I would always want people to know that there's no shame in it. And often wives are very clear to say, I wish I hadn't, but I did. I went ahead and looked in a journal of my husband's. It was left open. I had access to it. And often when we're in a hypervigilant and hyper regulated state, we're beginning to look for safety and information. And so definitely, while it's not desirable and most women are able to say, this is not the person I want to be, this isn't what I want to do, but now what do I do with this information that I've had? And one of the areas that the wives were asking about is that through perhaps through reading a journal and or just through discussions, becoming aware of resentment that their husband may have had towards them for any number of ways. They weren't enough. They didn't do this. They felt like they weren't present enough. They didn't hear them enough. They chose the kids over, whatever it is. Even, we could talk about it just in that bulk of that my husband's feeling a lot of resentment towards me. And I don't know what to do about that. And even in light of where we are now, that feels super unfair. That I have to process through. How do I process, I guess, is one of the questions. How do I process this amount of resentment my husband has towards me?
Yeah. Let's first kind of talk about journaling and kind of what is the role of journaling. And what I would often say is journaling is intended to be a safe space where all of me is able to be present. And so using our language, it's a place where my survivor man gets to just be present and write. And it's also a place where my wise man gets to be present and write. One of the things that in my therapy experience, I was a part of a therapy group for years. One of the things that we talked about was that the group was a safe place for our survivor man to show up, that I could just be there with me raw, unfiltered, unprocessed, just who I was. And in fact, in this particular therapy group, they would do these weekend workshops. And one of the exercises, one of the practices was you were to introduce your survivor man to the other people there. And you were to be very clear about how your survivor man operated, and you were to introduce your survivor man to them. And it was, I think, two-part. One is the clearer I am about my own survivor strategies, then the more attuned I can be into that for myself. But then if I'm clear with my community how my survivor man operates, then they can be looking for it also. And so I often say to the men in our group, in the groups that I lead, this is a place for your survivor man. Now, part of it, though, is recognizing this is my survivor man, that I'm acknowledging that. I'm just going to unleash whatever's going on with me unfiltered. And there's a wonderful practice in the Book of Lamentations where the way the Book of Lamentations is set up, it's a lament, and 80% of it is basically talking about how disappointed they are with God. And basically it's, God, you are a loser. And then there's this wonderful transition for the last 20% where the writer says, and yet, God, I will trust you. And so one of the things that may be true for those who journal, 80% of it is just about how they perceive life and what's not working and how horrible it is and how mad they are about situations. And it can be unfiltered, raw, and it can be totally from their survivor. And yet that last 20% can be a clear declaration of truth coming from their wise adult. And so even as we're talking about this, as you know, again, we would not encourage a woman to read a journal without her husband's permission. But if she has, I would encourage her to recognize that this may be unfiltered, unprocessed parts of her husband that he doesn't necessarily like about himself or understand about himself. And so if something can be seen as just mine, then I may show parts of myself that I'm not proud of or I don't like to it. And for those of you who use journal as a spiritual practice to, attune to yourself, my encouragement is if that's part of what you do is just read it raw or write it raw, also allow yourself to end it with some declaration of truth that regrounds you. That can be very helpful. And I have never read Beth's journals, and she told me one time, you probably don't want to, and you may want to just shred these when I'm gone versus read them. And I'm going to trust her that that's what's true. Because when our life exploded, my guess is the words that she used to describe me were probably not
complimentary.
Probably were not affirming. And that's exactly where she needed to be, and I want to honor that. And so the first thing I would say is, whatever you read in your husband's journal, read it through that filter of this may not be the best version of him, and this may not be the fullness of the truth. It may be part of the truth. We often talk about at the men's workshop, if it's not the fullness of the truth, it's not the truth. And we don't live in an either or. And so it can be a both and. He has said these things about you that are difficult. He may resent you. And there may still be this place that loves you and is thankful for you. That can be true even if it's not in the journal.
Well, I really like that part that you said, too, in the journal. It was the place where, for sure, pre-recovery, before somebody knew a journal could be sort of that place to process fully. But that it's a place that his survivor man got to show up and be right. And that there was no challenge to that. I just got to feel this. And nobody was talking me out of it. No one was trying to invalidate it. I think that is a helpful little detail. Yeah.
Well, and I actually think that there is a benefit to ranting. One of the most beautiful things in community is if I have people in my community that I can rant with, and they can just be with me in that and hold that, then if I can offload whatever the rant is about, then typically behind that is truth. But if I keep myself from the rant, I may never be able to get to the truth. And I do think whether you're the person struggling with the addiction or you're the wife who's been betrayed, there's just stuff about life that needs to be ranted about. And the safe places where I can do that, whether it's a journal or in my community or in a friendship, I'm going to do that. And the key is if you're the person receiving the ranting, that you are also reminding yourself that this isn't the fullness of the truth. This is part of the truth, and it's not the fullness of the truth. So the first thing I would say is, we talked about this resentment. And so it doesn't have to be in reading a journal.
Right.
It could simply be in the way the husband is showing up and the wife is thinking, you have just betrayed me and now you're telling me you resent me. That isn't a great combination.
Right.
And so I think part of it is recognizing that resentment is typically, in my opinion, a place where there is grief and there is anger. And what has happened is I didn't feel permission to express the grief and I didn't feel permission to express the anger. So those have gotten twisted together and they're coming out unclean. Because there could be some things that legitimately he could be angry about, you know, an old conversation, an old pattern in the relationship. Because what is true is when someone enters recovery, one of the things that we're encouraging them to do is look at the patterns in their lives. And patterns historically with parents, patterns in their current relationship with spouse, in friendships, in work relationships. And so what may be true is the man is becoming aware of some unhealthy patterns, and in that he's coming to the place of resentment. And the thing I would say is if someone is in resentment, I think it's helpful to separate those and ask two different questions. What am I angry about here? In what way can my anger be valid, and what is that anger about? And then the other one is, and where is the loss? You know, if my wife and I have spent 20 years, 30 years in this pattern in our relationship, it's cost both of us. And so what may be true is he doesn't know how to grieve that, and so it's just showing up as resentment. The anger and the grief get combined.
One of the ways I like to understand resentment also is an unexpressed or unmet need. And that I've sort of allowed that to be kind of focused on somebody else, some ways. And I think I like to define it that way because perhaps it's been unmet and there's anger or loss because of that. But perhaps also I haven't been able to identify it, articulate it, and own that this has been my need. I haven't asked for it. And so when I haven't done that deep work myself first to be able to understand I have a need here, I sort of just, this is my silly language, I sort of hairy eyeball my spouse for the ways they haven't done, they haven't been able to meet that need for myself, for me, even though perhaps I haven't done the work to articulate, here's my need, and to be able to go about meeting it for myself as a wise adult in a life-giving way. And so I stay sort of in this, you're not meeting my need type way.
Well, and I think a part of that is typically in recovery, when we start to discover our anger or our grief, the easiest target are the people that we're currently in relationship with. And so using what you just said, I didn't know how to express my need, and I resent my wife for not meeting a need that she didn't know about. So it's easy for me to be angry at the person who's closest, which would be my wife. But the reality is, if I do a little bit of digging, I ask the question, where did I lose my voice? Or where originally was my need not validated and affirmed? And typically we begin to discover there is a lot of grief and loss and anger at patterns of the past. And so I see it a lot where many men who come to our workshop have this, in my opinion, a misunderstanding of loyalty to their original family, you know, their family of origin. And so it's like they grew up with this message, sometimes clearly communicated, never say anything about the family. And so they're starting to dig into their story, and it's like they come up against this wall of, I can't go there. And so I stay in a place that feels safer. And so I'm just offloading all of my anger, resentment, grief, whatever it is, on my wife, on my marriage. But the reality is it predates her. And, you know, we often talk about this idea of if you're hysterical, it's historical. Or, you know, if you're having a $100 reaction to a $10 issue, you got to figure out what the other $90 is about.
Good math.
Yeah, it took me a while. But the reality is a lot of that predates my spouse. And I'm not serving myself or my marriage or my spouse if I'm just dumping everything on her. And so getting back in there and saying, okay, where did I lose my voice? And how can I find it now in my relationship? One other thing I would just say is a pattern that we see is a lot of men who come through the workshop would identify themselves as placators. And I think that's part of the unhealthiness of an addiction. I've got this coping strategy, this addiction in my life. It's creating chaos. And so I find myself showing up in my relationships in an unhealthy, unwise way, not asking for my needs. And so it makes sense when I engage recovery, one of the things I'm going to work on is asking for my needs.
And also, when working with couples, one of the ways that just sort of gets exacerbated is when we look to our partner to be the sole meter of our needs. If I don't have good community, if I've had a long history of like rigid boundaries with the outside world, and I'm really focused on getting all of my needs met from my partner, I think that's where a lot of wives, husbands, both sides, we end up feeling the brunt of all of that resentment because I have perhaps an over need that I'm all directing to my partner. It's not appropriate for them to be the sole meter of that need. Yeah.
And what can be true is, in this particular case where a husband is writing in his journal, he may be aware that given what he has done and the level of betrayal, that it isn't appropriate for him to share yet with his wife some of the resentment. And so he was making a conscious choice to put it in the journal or to take it to his community and not share it with her yet. And maybe he's aware that it's survivorish and unprocessed. And so there can be this idea of, if I don't have a community or if I don't have a safe space to offload some of these things, it will show up in our relationship. One other thing that can be true, though, is we may believe that we are really good at containing some of these things that we are experiencing, and the reality is we're not. We're leaking them. And so what may be true is this wife was aware before reading the journal that there was this energy that was coming towards her that she didn't fully understand. And when she read it in the journal, she goes, yeah, that's what it is. It's this resentment. And I remember clearly several times Beth saying to me, Greg, I think you're just angry with me. And I was in some kind of denial and I wasn't fully present and I was still codependent. And I didn't want her to think I was angry. So there was a lot of reasons, but I would deny and go, no, I'm not. Well, the good news is because of all the work I've done in therapy, I can now say to my wife, yes, I am angry at you. And I don't always do it cleanly. That's one of the things I'm working on. I do believe I can do it safely, and I do. But it is important that whatever it is that is happening between the two of us, we're able to be open and honest and clean about that.
So I often tell even the wives that I'm working with that there's a lot of emotions in the Christian church that we feel like are unacceptable, anger and resentment being two really key ones. There's sort of this sense, those are the bad ones, whatever you can do to get rid of those. But that I tell clients, I like resentment. Because it tells me that I have an unexpressed or unmet need. And now I can do the work of that and looking for where there are appropriate ways. But also anger. Anger is almost always in defense of something good. What good thing is my anger defending? That helps us, I think, just reframe it. There's something good my anger is energetically in defense of. This is a good and helpful emotion.
Well, I even tell the men that anger actually is a redemptive emotion. If you think of the way that God created it, anger produces energy. And so if there's an unrighteousness, if there's an injustice that we are angry about, and then we get this energy and we steward that energy to a redemptive purpose, it becomes transformative. And so it's not about denying our anger, it's about stewarding our anger and allowing ourselves to see what is it that I am legitimately angry about. The other thing about this needs piece that is so significant is the way I talk about addiction. Addiction is whenever there's this legitimate need that I've been trying to meet in this illegitimate way in a repetitive pattern. So it makes perfect sense. Part of recovery is being able to identify my legitimate need and get that need met legitimately. Well, that begins with identifying it. That begins with that reality that I do have needs. I am needful. And if I can believe that truth, then I can start looking for what those needs are. And again, in our last podcast, we talked about the 7 desires. I think that if this need stuff is brand new to you, that's just a great place to start. Am I needing to be chosen? Am I needing to be affirmed? Am I needing to be included? And then from that, they may branch out to some more specific things. But, when we do our groups and when I do my group, one of the check-ins is always, what do you need? And I can tell you that even for men that have been in recovery for a long time, that need question is one of the most difficult. Because most of the men who struggle with addiction were never taught to validate, affirm, pursue their needs in any healthy way.
So that ties in a little bit to one of the other questions. Do you find that addiction, because it is really wrapped up in this whole idea of I'm not doing needs well in my life, do you find resentment is often or almost always a part of the journey?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And again, I think that it's one of those warning lights on the dashboard that we need to pay attention to. And so if resentment is an indication of a need, then it makes sense that I'm angry that that need has not been met, and I'm grieving the loss of that need. If you've listened to the podcast, I'm confident you've heard me say this, but I was introduced to this idea that wherever there's loss, there's grief. The greater the loss, the greater the grief. And as a culture, we are not good at grieving. We've been told that grief is weakness. We've been told to dismiss it. We've been told to sanitize it. When somebody dies, we try to contain it in 3 days. And when that person is buried, we're all assuming that we're supposed to be done with it. But grief is profound. It is an ongoing practice. Again, I often say that recovery is running a marathon on a track. You end up doing the same laps over and over again. And I've heard men say, I've heard women say, oh, I thought I had dealt with this before. Well, the answer is you have, and there's just more, and it's time to move towards it again. And I think that grief is a great example of that. That there's just, as I become aware of more loss and more things that have my addiction or this relationship or old patterns have cost me, then there's just grief that's going to come along with that.
So that's part of how you process and or move through or metabolize resentment is moving in. Yeah.
Yeah. It's always about moving towards, moving through, and moving beyond. And I would say, and I can shamelessly plug this, Beth, my wife, wrote a great book on grief. And she intentionally wrote it in such a way that, yes, she includes information about our journey and what my choices cost her and the grief associated with that. And she also includes all kinds of grief. The loss of her father when he died, the loss of her mother when she was diagnosed with Alzheimer's. She tells the story of a family who lost everything in a fire. And she also offers spiritual practices that can bring an entry point into the grief and not necessarily just leave you there. So there are resources out there. And if someone is saying, I don't know how to grieve well, I just want to say, welcome to the club. We haven't been taught how to do it. And, if you're one of those people that love studying things in the Bible, one of the things I would encourage is just do a study on grief. Both in the Old Testament and the New Testament, they took it seriously because I think God understands the danger of getting stuck in our grief. And a lot of times people are afraid that grief means you're stuck. Actually, grief means you're moving forward. One of the ways you can know you're grieving well is it's moving you forward. You still may be in the midst of it, but it is moving you forward. And there's so much chaos and pain and toxicity when we avoid our grief or we do get stuck in it.
Well, I just wasn't quite sure he was done there. I just thought I'd let it go.
Yeah.
But I do appreciate his ongoing promotion of our bookstore. That's the third title that I'm sure we're going to sell out of. But you're right. Beth's book is a wonderful resource. This has been a great subject matter today. We could have gone another couple of podcasts.
Yeah.
And what's true is there are more questions.
There's more
So
questions.
you could expect Rebecca back
All right, good.
to
Exactly.
continue the conversation of the questions that she got.
Yeah, we so appreciate you taking the time and all the prep that you did in doing it. You're a blessing to those that you counsel and a blessing to us here on the rest of your team. We'd like to thank you for joining us today on the Faithful and True podcast. We invite you to visit our faithfulandtrue.com website where you'll find many more podcasts like this one. And believe it or not, there's over 400 of them. So we're always pleased when we get the feedback that certain individuals listen to them every day when you were talking about running. And there's a lot of people that get their exercise and have the earbuds and listen to the podcast. And we're just happy to lend any help that we can. We also want to make you aware of our 3-day intensive workshops that we offer here at Faithful and True. Every month we do the Men's Journey Workshop. And that information, as well as a video on that page that explains all about the kind of the most frequently asked questions that men have about, would this event be right for me? And then we have the Women's Journey Workshop, and we have 2 different couples journey workshops. All that information is on the website, and we invite you to check that all out. In the meantime, we thank you again. We hope that you'll join us soon, and hope that this coming week will be a week for you is filled with many blessings and with great vision.